it's a great pleasure to have David Martin back with us this evening. He seems to make a regular annual trip to London. So I'll just briefly introduce him. He is curator for Cascadia Art Museum in Edmonds, Washington, in the States, and is a great expert on the artistic activities of Washington State. And the relevance to us is that there were a lot of Japanese artists in Washington State over the 20th century. And David has done some wonderful work really popularizing or bringing to light the work that they did. Of course, things went a bit wrong for them during the Second World War, and that those memories were in danger of being erased. So we've had a couple of wonderful talks from David in the past, one on photographers and one on painters, and there may have been another one as well, but we can't remember. So anyway, this evening, David is going to be talking about the influence of Japanese prints on artists of the northwest of the US. So I think I'll leave my introduction to that and over to you, David.
All right. Can you hear me okay? I want to mention first that I do not have a cold. I'm having a bad allergy day, hay fever. So don't worry about catching anything from me at all. Please come over and say hello. And thank you for having me back again. So as Jason mentioned, I have two different pairs of glasses. Well, that's why I have to make sure I can see which one's better for me over here. Okay. Now, a lot of people, let's see, here we go. A lot of people that I've met in Europe have heard of Seattle, but they don't really know where it is. And I've had everything from, are you near New York? Are you near Florida? And actually we are not. I'm originally from New York State, Western New York State, Niagara Falls, you might have heard of that. And when I moved to Seattle in 1986, I was starting to do research on the regional artists of Washington State and Oregon, and I noticed that a lot of the artists who had been forgotten were Japanese, or Asian American, I would say some Chinese American as well, but mostly Japanese. The funny thing that I discovered was that the Japanese artists who emigrated really did not show much of an influence of their Japanese heritage. It was kind of a reverse. It was more Japanese influence on Caucasian artists, mostly children or grandchildren of immigrants, and the opposite, where there was a Western tradition that was being absorbed by local Japanese artists. So we're going to talk about some of those today. I'm going to introduce you to some artists you've probably never heard of. And as you can see by this funny little map that I pulled off of the internet, you can see that the proximity of Seattle to Japan. It was a port of entry at the turn of the century, and a lot of the Japanese immigrants either went to San Francisco or Seattle and then moved into the Northwest, moved into Canada, and some making their way to throughout the United States, and some on the East Coast as well. Now, some of these things, some of these works of art do not really look like Japanese prints initially, like what we're talking about. But I wanted to show you some of the influences that are not immediately recognizable. And so I'm starting with a woman named Myra Albert Wiggins, who was the first internationally known artist from the Northwest. Wiggins was a photographer. She was also a painter, but she became well known as a photographer initially. She worked with Alfred Stieglitz, if you know who Alfred Stieglitz was in the United States, and became a close friend of his, and worked between New York and Oregon, which is where she originally lived. Now, there's two people that I want to mention, and both of them are women. And the tie-in for the Japanese influence, you'll see in a minute. Okay, so Myra Albert Wiggins, you're looking at a photo of her, a work called Homesickness from 1902, that's a platinum print, and a work called The Forge of 1897. The Forge is typical of a lot of pictorialism in the United States at the time, or art photography. Wiggins was so well, that image became so well known that it was part of the collection of Eastman Kodak. What was Eastman's first name? George Eastman, yes, sorry. It was part of George Eastman's collection, and it remained in his studio, in his office in Rochester, New York, until his death. And because of that one image, Wiggins received a lot of works, a lot of patronage from George Eastman, including several trips to Europe, where she photographed, including London, and won over 50 international awards by 1910. Now, what I want to tell you about homesickness, do you see the formatting difference, how it's almost like an Oban style of a Japanese print? It's a vertical style. This would fit in very well with today's, today's outlook on some photographic artists, contemporary and younger artists, because what you're looking at is completely not real. The image that you're looking at is sort of a Vermeer in photography, Vermeer influence, and you see the woman and the little girl staring out, out through the window, and being homesick for their homeland, right? What you're actually looking at is a room that was built by Myra Wiggins, by the photographer, and all of the walls and the window area, that was actually the front door to her house in this little town in Washington State. And so what she did was she built an armature out of wood and then stretched muslin and covered the muslin with stained tea stains and coffee stains and mud, so it would look like an interior. And then she looked at old master paintings and copied the clothing in the old master paintings to dress her models in. Now, I'm telling you this because at the time in the United States, and it probably was true here unfortunately, women were discriminated against pretty badly. A lot of times early on, that women would have to disguise their gender through their art, and Wiggins is one of several people in the Northwest who used a Japanese style cipher using just her initials. Can you see it there okay? The MAW standing for Myra Albert Wiggins. She used this on pretty much all of her photography, and she showed these three works in a very important exhibition in the United States at the Albright Gallery in Buffalo, New York. And she was the only artist from Washington State and from the Northwest to be included in this exhibition, and you can see that she's still doing her, what she called Dutch genre scenes, works that were influenced by Vermeer and other Dutch masters. Another artist that I noticed this same type of usage of a little cipher to obscure her gender is the subject of my latest book. Her name was Beulah Loomis Hyde, and that's a self-portrait of her there and a drawing from 1902. And can you see the little cipher in the corner, the right-hand corner, where she's drawing her name, and that's a backwards B, and then her L is this sort of mountain-shaped figure that is up on the top of the B. So this is something that happened in the Northwest part of the United States, but also happened throughout the United States as well, in different situations. But it was primarily women who did this to disguise their gender for fear of being rejected from exhibitions. Here's one of Miss Hyde's works that you can see she was very much influenced by Japanese art. Here is her painting there on your left, and a block print by Hiroshiga, and you can see the similarities of the work, the influence that starts to spring up in her work based on her interest in Japanese prints and her interest in Asian antiques and art. I hope you don't mind, but her granddaughter is right over there. She lives here in London. Thank you for coming, and other members of Miss Hyde's family as well. Thank you for coming. Okay, so Seattle is not as old as London. We had the art exhibitions, the art arts organizations really start at the around 1880 to 1900, and the most prominent exhibitions were Japanese prints, ukiyo-e, and other types of Japanese prints. And this is what the local people of that had money to buy artwork and to collect art, this is what they were collecting. So you can see this is a booklet from the Seattle Fine Arts Association from 1908. Thank you, the Seattle Public Library. And this is what the local artists were starting to look at. So if you had a young artist who was born, say, in 1880 or 1890, this is what they would see. Your local artist would, here in London, would go to the National Gallery or something to see what other artists are doing all over the world. And in Seattle, they were seeing primarily Japanese prints. Now these, this type of influence of Japanese prints spread throughout the United States by a man named Arthur Wesley Dow, who was curator of, assistant curator of prints and Asian art at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in Massachusetts. And Dow had a sort of a synthesis of Asian culture in his printmaking and in his painting. Here's some examples of his work. And what he was doing was basically rejecting traditional Western compositional effects and introducing the works of, or the compositional elements of Japanese prints, flattening the subject out, compressing the image into a long vertical, and basically filling a space in a beautiful way. Now some people, at least one of the artists I'm going to be showing you shortly, actually studied with Arthur Wesley Dow. Many people in the United States, many artists of that generation either studied with him or studied with students of his, or was taught his type of belief system through his book called Composition, which was first published in 1899. And you can see he's using his three elements. One of them is called notan. That's a Japanese term that was used to, sort of like what we would call chiaroscuro today. And so many people were influenced by Arthur Wesley Dow. And you can see a real shift from the people who were studying with him or studying using his book within the United States. Things were kind of falling away from the influence of the French, the School of Paris, and that type of influence, and then looking at a sort of a more modern approach, using Dow as a guideline. So this is a man, oh, I should have mentioned Arthur Wesley Dow. If you haven't heard of him, you might have heard of some of his famous students. One, probably the most famous, was Georgia O'Keeffe. Charles Sheeler, who actually developed a very interesting technique of almost a photorealistic type of style. So this Lancewood Hart was from Aberdeen, Washington. It was a sleepy little lumber town in Washington State near the coast. And Lancewood Hart studied in the United States, in Chicago, and studied within the region of Seattle and just outside of Seattle. And you can see his self-portrait called In My Atelier from 1919, where he's using effects by, again, using the Japanese influence from Arthur Wesley Dow and just the sort of system of almost abstraction that he was learning and progressing with at the time. His watercolor there in the corner that you see was heavily influenced by Japanese and Chinese scroll painting. These are just the type of works that you would see as exercises in Dow's collection and in Dow's book called Composition. And then once again you see Lance Hart adopting the use of a symbol or a cipher based on the Japanese. And I'm sorry I don't have a pointer here, but if you look at this over here, that's his LWH combined to make it look like a Japanese, you know, image type of thing to show his interest in these in this type of work. And you can see from from Dow's influence there, the multiple use of these compressed images where the flowers, I believe they're tulips there, and you're looking at different types of backgrounds using the same, almost the same exact image with different backgrounds, seeing things at different parts of the day, and compressing the images again, cropping. The cropping's very unusual for a lot of these studies that were done at the time, and within Washington State. And then he starts getting very acquainted with artists like Hokusai. And in 1919, he was commissioned to do a series of large murals that were, I believe, 8 by 15 feet high. And he did what some of the other artists in Washington State did. They traveled, right? They were influenced by artists from Japan and Japanese culture. But then when they were active in Washington State, there was also the Native American culture, the coastal Native Americans, the indigenous culture, and you start to see this very interesting blend of cultural references showing up in the art of this particular region. So you can see that this is one of the panels called Spirit of the Trade Winds, and that's part of this big mural cycle. And if you take a look at the Hokusai, the Great Wave, everyone knows that image, right? You can see the influence of the way that he was stylizing that water crashing against the rocks there in the lower left. You can see the same type of influence in the panel called Spirit of the Coast, where you had Native American, Northwest Coast Native Americans, and then if you see this also work by Hokusai. Do you see the way the waterfall is falling there, and then you see it the delineation by Hokusai, this sort of almost abstract imagery used by Mr. Hart in his mural. Here's the two of the other two panels, and you see once again this influence. Ambrose Patterson was an artist who was originally from Australia. He was very successful as an impressionist painter and started creating prints, woodblock prints based on the Japanese. He made his way to Seattle around 1918 to become the head of the art department at the University of Washington. But before that, he was active in California, and he was also active in Hawaii. And here's one of his really beautiful prints of the Kilauea volcano erupting from 1917, and you see the very deep influences as well. He had a very interesting life before he came to the United States. He was the companion of the opera singer Nellie Melba. And I'm using that term companion. I guess you could also use the word boy toy for, for his relationship with her. Now, here is one of your native daughters, Elizabeth Cooper, who was from Nottingham, born and raised. She met and fell in love with a fellow English citizen, and they got married and decided her husband became an importer of Japanese antiquities, Japanese prints, and Chinese antiquities as well. So by the time they ended up first in San Francisco and then in Seattle around 1915 or so, she was adapting the works that her husband was actually selling and using the local scene of Seattle to produce these beautiful works as Magnolia Bridge. You can see the heavy influence of the Hiroshige print, and she did a whole series of these watercolors. They're actually gouache, tempera, and ink, so they aren't necessarily prints, but she did do a whole series of them based on this Japanese influence. She also did some of her earlier prints were also starting to become influenced by the Japanese, but she was holding on to some of her other influences. If you look at the imagery up on the top left, do you see, I don't know, I could be wrong, but I see a little bit of the influence of your Bloomsbury group in this. When I went through her effects with her grandson, she had actually Duncan Grant watercolor, and she had several exhibition catalogs of Duncan Grant. So I think she was influenced by the Bloomsbury group, but let that go in favor of this Japanese influence that was so successful in that region. Now, here's one of her blocks. I wanted to show you the block and two of the prints pulled from it. And they usually with a Japanese print, you know, they're done, the artist designs them, and then artisans carve the blocks. You need multiple blocks to create an overlapping of different blocks, sometimes 10, 20 different blocks for different colors and different effects. Well, this is something that was used at the time developed by an American. So they're called Provincetown prints, or they're also called white line prints. And they were developed in Provincetown, which is the end of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. It's the farthermost eastern point in the United States. And it was then and still is an art colony where people got together from different parts of the country and exchanged ideas with different, from different sources. So B.J.O. Nordfelt was the man credited with developing this. And what it is, I'm going back to this, you see the block here, instead of multiple blocks that are used in traditional Japanese printmaking, you carve one block. And what you do is you create the image, you carve it all out, so you have this sort of little funnel in between around surrounding it, almost like a little island of color. And so you can, these prints are basically more painterly than a traditional block print because you can alter the effects. You can see the different types of effects you can use by altering the inking or the painting of them. They're actually quite beautiful. And some of the artists that were teaching at the University of Washington at the time went to Provincetown during the summer and learned this technique and brought it all the way across the country, where a number of artists from Washington and particularly Seattle practiced this tradition of white line prints developed on the East Coast. So the one image that I'm showing you is Ruth Pennington, that's from about 1928. You see the beach scene over here. And that's a very beautiful rendition of a beach scene, but in the style of somewhat Japanese, but mostly through the use of the white line or Provincetown print. She figures into the talk I'm going to show you a little bit later because some of these artists actually traveled to Japan and ended up studying there a little bit later. This is the case with Elizabeth Warhanick, who was originally from the Philadelphia area. This is a photo of her in Japan in 1907. And she was one of the foremost practitioners in Seattle of this white line type of block printing method. Here's one called On Puget Sound that you can see there on your left. And then she also got into using different types of abstractions using this technique. They're very painterly, and a lot of times she would use images based on Cubism and other sources, mostly from European sources. So again, we have this amalgamation of different cultural references within these within these prints. This is one of my favorites. It's actually, it's called Provincetown print. And there you see on your left is the block where you can see the block was carved away. She produces the image, and of course it's going to, once it's printed, it's going to print in the opposite of the way the block is carved. So there's the actual block that she used, and then the composition by painting it. painting these little islands of recessed, the recession, around the recession, sorry, these sort of little islands of relief that you could use. And the way they did that, rather than with the multiple use of the block printing, of multiple blocks, say 20 or 30, whatever, traditional Japanese, the block was registered up at the top and then hand painted per whatever color they wanted to use, put down, rubbed, so you don't even need a press to do it, and rubbed a certain way, and then lifted off, and then you get this beautiful series of printing, blending colors in a more of a modern way than what you would normally see, and they're looser. Again, they're more painterly than what you would see in a Japanese print. So Elizabeth Colborn was an artist that was not born in Seattle, but came as a very young child, actually. She was from, I believe she was from North Dakota or South Dakota, and she had a tragedy happen. There were 3 girls in the family. She was she was the middle girl of 3 children that her parents had. And unfortunately, both of the parents died within 6 months of each other. So she was sort of sent off, all 3 of the girls were sent off to different parts of the country where the where the different aunts or cousins lived. And so she ended up in this town called Bellingham, which is north of Seattle, close to the Canadian border. And to sort of deal with her grief, she became obsessed with art at a very young age, mostly due to being very close to her father, who was an artist, not a professional artist, but a professional engineer and a hobbyist painter. So she followed, by keeping her father's memory alive, she produced art that's really quite beautiful. And she was a student of Arthur Wesley Dow, and you can see these are multiple block prints done in the traditional Japanese style. This is a work that was very heavily influenced, as you can see, the Hiroshige print of the owl with the moon on the back, and then the long vertical one is by Elizabeth Colborn. And I did a book on her in an exhibition about 15 years ago. And unfortunately, she never married or had any children. And she left very little information about her life, about her private life or about her professional life. And so it was very difficult, but right in the middle of writing my essay about her to accompany her works, I found stored in one of the libraries in the area that she was living in, I found a diary that had her personal observations of nature. She would go out into the wilderness. She was a mountain climber, so you can see the influence of right there. She was a mountain climber and would just go off for months at a time into the wilderness and live by herself and produce these beautiful carving the blocks on nature, right in nature, and also noticing the life around her, the flora and the fauna that was surrounding her, and gave her a great deal of peace to produce her art. She actually became well known in New York at the time. She was, while she was producing these beautiful block prints, she also became an illustrator. Now you can see 2 different variations of her traditional Japanese style printmaking using multiple blocks. I believe this one had nearly 30 blocks that she used for a lumber mill in Bellingham Bay, which is the area she lived in. And you can see the type of different types of effects you can do, atmospheric effects, by just inking these in a different manner. She did follow a very traditional manner of inking, but also liked to experiment as well. She used the ground mica in some of her inks and other sort of traditional methods, but making them, again, more of a modern expression, and then sending them to New York, where she was had a very good gallery representation and exhibited quite a bit there. So this is typical of one of her children's books, illustrations. And you see here's a little child with a parasol. And that's how she became famous throughout the United States through her writing and illustrating children's books. And this is one of my favorite prints by her, Red Cedars, Old and New, Washington, from about 1930. And you can see the beautiful type of patterning effect that she used by using these multiple blocks to describe these very soft, almost fern-like qualities of these cedar trees that are, when they're young like that, the branches are very, very soft and have this beautiful green tone. And this particular print, it's the only one known about it, known of it, is also has the ground mica in it, and also shows the influence of her teacher, Arthur Wesley Dow. And you can see these are very traditional, almost observations of Japanese prints that she's adapting to her environment. The local Lake Whatcom, and then Mount Baker, Washington, where she's put the mountain in her backyard, substituting it as a replacement for Mount Fuji. Now, some of her friends that were making prints at the time were these two brothers, Waldo Chase and Corwin Chase. And they were born and raised in Seattle, and they were very unique young men right from the start. They were raised in a very open-minded household, and the mother was a sort of Mother Teresa figure in Seattle, taking care of the poor and homeless at the turn of the century, and they became obsessed with Japanese prints. And because there was no one there to teach them at the time, they had to learn by purchasing books and experimenting. Now, what was unusual about these two brothers was that they were what you would say like a naturalist. They were always outdoors. They would, Corwin there, the man with the Davy Crockett kind of hat there, was a guide for mountain climbing up Mount Rainier, and that's how some of their, they earned some of their living by doing guides up to the mountains. And then they start making these prints. These are the first two prints that they made by using methods that they found at the library. So they were collaborative prints using the word Chenuis, which was the original Indian name for one of the peaks of Mount Rainier. And you can see the top two are the same print. One of them's inked to give the effect of a nighttime scene. The other one is a daylight scene. So this is, why did they do it this way? Okay, they didn't have any money. They could increase their production and make more money by changing the inking. So if you were to buy one of their prints and you had the one on the left, if they inked it in a different way to show a nocturnal scene, then you could get sort of the same effect without having to carve a bunch of blocks again. So they were really thinking ahead, trying to support themselves, and they would take their prints up into the mountains when they were doing tours for people, especially younger people. And when they got to a site, they would pull the prints out, and they had two different variations. They would try to sell them to the male mountain climbers, and for the female mountain climbers, they were giving them away in order to find dates. It worked out very well for both of them. Now, in the 1920s, 27 was the first year, there was a Japanese artist, please excuse me if I'm mispronouncing the name, Yamagishi Kazue, who came to the United States because there was so much interest in the Japanese technique of block printing, especially in the Northwest, that he came to teach people how to do it properly. So again, the two brothers, when they were, they lived in teepees. Do you know what a teepee is? I know. Okay, so this is Waldo's teepee, and this was very intriguing to Mr. Yamagishi, Kazue Yamagishi, and he did a print of his student's teepee that he was living in. So he taught them how, both of the brothers, how to correctly carve blocks. And here's some variations of the same block that I was mentioning before. So this print is called Nomad. It's the name of the ship that's depicted in the print, but these are all variations using the same exact blocks, but different inking methods. I also found this really intriguing print of portraits. One of the brothers, Waldo, was making prints in the 1920s of portraiture. And when I saw this one, you can see who I was thinking of over here. Because this is from 1928, and then several decades later, Andy Warhol's doing something kind of similar, except using people who were sort of part of the New York scene and American icons. But 30 years or 40 years previously, Waldo Chase was doing portraits of famous writers from Seattle area, musicians, and most of these have perished in a fire, but this one is one of the only ones that survived. You can see the singeing around it, around the border of the print. And then Corwin's masterpiece, this took 36 different blocks of carving. It's the old Indian word for Mount Rainier, which is Mount Tacoma or Mount Tahoma. And the print is very big. It's about like this. 16 by 20, I believe, is the image. And it's quite a beautiful Japanese style print done using local subject matter. And here he is with one of his other really great prints called Summerland, which is a section of Mount Rainier. And there he is with his first wife. I don't know if you can see her, but he's sitting in the teepee with his first wife. It didn't last, the marriage didn't last too long. He was kind of a scoundrel. And she left him pretty quickly. The other one married too, but I think that marriage lasted for 2 months. They were kind of randy guys. And so here we are, you see he was also a photographer, so sometimes what he would do is make studies with his camera. Then the two brothers would go out into the wilderness, into their teepees, and then carve the blocks and print them. Now one of the unusual things about Corwin, the one brother who did the very large one that I just showed you, and this one of Summerland, he was also, I guess you would call them proto-hippies. These, in the teens and 20s, he was, well, I'll just show you. He was a nudist, I guess you would call it. One day I found in his writings that he was in his teepee and he was printing one of his blocks of Mount Baker. And he was using this, this sort of deep indigo blue, and he was naked, and he was using it, and some of the ink dripped on his leg, on his thigh. So he's in there in his teepee, stark naked, and then he starts drawing the circle because it was almost like a dye, and it would not have been easy to wash off. So he starts doing it, and then his current girlfriend comes to the teepee with one of her friends, and his girlfriend wasn't shocked at all, but the friend accompanying her was. She was an artist herself, and you'll meet her in a second. And so what she did was she said, well, I'm going to finish painting you. And so she finished decorating his body. Can you see the circles and things? So she finished, this is done in 1929. Very unusual in the United States. It's very British in the United States, but not in this section. And so she did a whole series of his painted body throughout the wilderness and just outside of Seattle, just south of Seattle. And taking a cue from the beauties that you see, the female beauties that you see in many Japanese prints, she decides to do a group of images of her boyfriend in the nude and called them male beauties. And for this process, she used the bromoil transfer. And are you familiar with that? I can tell you real briefly what it is. You see the image up on the upper left, the black and white image? Okay, so that's what you would say is the source the source for these other images. So she takes the print and completely bleaches it out, and it leaves a trace, it leaves an area of the on the photographic paper, and then she takes a brush that sort of looks like a shaving brush and pounces it onto the photograph using different colors, and that's what you're seeing, the one in the center and the one to the right, that sort of orange coloring. So she inks them. It's almost used like an etching process. She's inked the actual black and white photo that had been bleached away, and then puts it through a press, like an etching press, and then it transfers the image off of the photograph onto another piece of paper. So that's why the key image that you see of her boyfriend there is reversed, because it's processed and then goes through a printing press and reverses itself, copies itself onto another piece of paper. Very intriguing type of process for that time in the Northwest. She also had very bad luck with these men that she was involved with. So you can see, here's Corwin laying in a little pool out in the forest, and then you see the sort of series, I don't know if you can see it very well, but you see all of the series of her male suitors, her male boyfriends, kind of falling from a tree, ending up all face down in the foreground of the print. Here she is. This is Verna Hafer. This is the artist who was his girlfriend at the time, and she was a printmaker and a photographer. That's a self-portrait of her from probably the 1920s, I would guess by the haircut. And she was part of a group called the Seattle Camera Club that formed in the early 1920s in Seattle. And they were almost all Issei, first-generation Japanese Americans that were pictorialist photographers. And she was one of only two Caucasian artists, photographers, who were part of that group, and she became internationally known because of her association with the Seattle Camera Club. But she had, a lot of her photos have this sort of influence of Japanese prints that you can see in the cherry branch, which is the translation of that says cherry branch on it. And that's also that bromoil process that I was telling you about. So again, she's using the idea of printmaking, but only adapting it to photography. So it's going through a press like you would press a relief print, and then it ends up being a reverse image of what she originally started with. And then her very almost disturbing 1929 self-portrait. Now when I saw that self-portrait at first, I thought this was unusual because a lot of times people didn't want to make themselves look like monsters like she did in this image. And her son, who became I never met her, but her son became a close friend of mine, said that she was interested in Japanese ghost stories. And they, I think they're called kwaidan, or kaidan. And you'll see in a second so that influences this self-portrait. And then she's doing all of these block prints, sort of based on the Japanese, but adapting to different cultures. And on the left image, you will see a depiction of her with her first husband and her little son. He's born in 1923, so this is about 1927 or 28. And then the middle block print from 1928 was called Phallic Worship. That shows her and her husband before if you look at the background behind the crucifix, you'll see what she's talking about, the phallic worship. And then the disintegration and the falling apart of her relationship in the lower part here, where they're both, and rather than connected anymore, they're looking away from each other, and the relationship has come to an end. Here's an image of one of the photographs that she did called Gianpaolo from 1927. And if you see the man up in the corner, that's Yukio Morinaga, who was one of the Seattle Camera Club members, and actually had quite an incredible successful career during the 1920s through the Seattle Camera Club. In around 1927-28, he was actually the second most exhibited pictorialist photographer in the entire world. Now, he was a very close friend of Verna Hafer. He was sort of a member of their family. He was her soulmate, but because he was gay, they did not marry, obviously. But the image of Gianpaolo that you can see there is based on these books that Kaidan, that Yukio Morinaga brought to the house because he was babysitting Verna's son quite a bit. So I kind of have to laugh when I say that Gianpaolo, because her son's name was Jean Paul, and Gianpaolo is the Italian version of it, Gianpaolo, and she has this sort of demented-looking figure. And I asked her, because 1927, he's born in 1923, that's a 4-year-old, and I said, what did you do to your mother to make her name this horrific image after you? He didn't know. But you can see that this scary image, Gianpaolo, which is a male name, that's actually one of her female friends posing for the character is using the Mia pose that you see in Japanese theater sometimes, where the eyes are wide open and crossing there. It's a very frightening image when you see it in person. And these are some of the Kaidan or Kwaidan images that influenced her photography. She also taught her young son, that's a self-portrait of him, of this beautiful, tender little image of the two of them. And she was married, but she raised the son herself. She got rid of her husband, her first husband, and she raised him herself. They were very, very close. And she started teaching him block printing. And these are a couple of the prints that he made when he was 5 and 6 years old that he gave to me about 20 years ago. And the first one is called Nora's Ark. Not Noah's Ark, he thought it was called Nora's Ark, because he had an aunt named Nora, and he thought that was her, her name. Right below the self-portrait with her son, you see an image that he made of his mother, and it's called Honey. And when I asked him, why did you call this Honey? He said, I called that, that's what I called my mother. I never called her Mom, I called her Honey. And I said, why did you call her Honey? And he said, because that's what my father called her. So I said, oh, okay, I guess that makes sense. But you can see how things were not too good around the house by these two prints that Jean was doing at the time when he was 5 or 6 years old. Angel throwing a man down to hell on the left. And then this frightening, almost totemic image of the mother screaming at the father. You could tell that household was not doing too well at the time. This is, I mentioned earlier, an artist named Ruth Pennington who helped form the Northwest Printmakers Society in 1928 and 29 in Seattle. And most of the prints that you see in the catalog from that time, it was just local. It was people from the University of Washington and people from Seattle and the Northwest that were exhibiting. Well, they promoted the Northwest printmakers so well, by 1935, Picasso was showing with them, and Georges Braque, and other very famous printmakers and painters from Europe were showing in Seattle because of these type of activities. So Frances Blakemore was one of the key early members of the Northwest Printmakers Society. And in the mid-30s, she and Ruth Pennington, who I showed you before, go to Japan, mostly to develop learning the language and learning more in-depth associations with the culture. During this time, she did this wonderful oil painting, almost in a primitive style, of the kilns of Shoji Hamada. Do you know his work? He was a very famous ceramic potter in Japan. And so this is kind of a historic image that she became friends with him. And she was depicting, sort of like in the US they call it the American scene, but she's doing the American scene in Japan, depicting everyday life. So there's Ruth and Frances Blakemore dressed in these kind of silly clothes in 1937 in Japan. And what they were doing is, because neither one of them had very much money, they would take the wealthy people from Seattle and take them on tours to, excuse me, to Japan. And that's how they were able to fund their travel and be able to stay in Japan learning the different process. Here's two of Frances's prints from that era, Far Eastern Madonna. These works were all created in Japan, her prints, but they were mailed or shipped back to Seattle for display with this, I was mentioning the Northwest Society, Printmakers Society. And then on the one on the left, Far Eastern Madonna is using that technique called white line printmaking, and then she does this other traditional, more block type of block work for, excuse my mispronunciation, Sado Gashima. Sorry if I mispronounced it. And that's one of her color block prints created in Japan and sent back to Seattle. Now, so Frances Blakemore was there through the 1930s in Japan, and then Ruth Pennington, her friend, would come back and forth leading these tours. But as things got progressively heated in Japan before Pearl Harbor, she went to Hawaii. And she stayed there and became involved with the US government making thought bombs. And she told me that she was actually there and she could see the planes flying over when Pearl Harbor was attacked. So she created a number of these thought bombs, and what they were was, I guess you would just basically call it propaganda. They were propaganda leaflets that were distributed and thrown out of airplanes and helicopters throughout Japan, warning the local citizens to vacate areas that the US was going to be bombing. And basically these were propaganda methods to try and turn the local citizens against their fascist government. So these are, very few of these have survived, but she did quite a few of them. She also introduced silkscreen printing to Japan. Here's one of her her textbook called Methods for Visual Expression in Silkscreen Printing from about 1950 or 51. And she designed the book, and she taught silkscreen printing in Japan, in Tokyo primarily. And there's one of her prints that was created during that time. Now, she wasn't satisfied to just create artwork. She wanted to support artists. Now, what happened was, after the war, she went back to Tokyo, and she wanted to stay there. And she wanted to buy a house. She wanted to continue to live the rest of her life in Japan. And so what she did was she wanted to buy a house, and at the time women weren't allowed to buy their own houses, so she had to find a man who would sign over for her so she could purchase the house. She found an American attorney there, and they fell in love and got married and proceeded to purchase quite a bit of land in Tokyo post-war. You can imagine what happened with that. They became extremely wealthy from it, but they were good citizens. They never lived in a manner that like a wealthy person would live. And so she set up, Frances set up an art gallery to promote modern and young Japanese printmakers. And you can still get this book. It's still kind of a standard book that she wrote on modern Japanese prints. I befriended both her and her husband towards the end of their life. They returned to Seattle and passed away there. But they left a very fine foundation that if any of you are looking for some support for Japanese studies, and especially language studies, you can apply to the Blakemore Foundation in Seattle. And they not only endowed this foundation to assist young scholars and young historians, but they also, well, they funded one of my books that on the Seattle Camera Club. They funded that. And they also gave most of the property that they owned, that they purchased post-war in Tokyo back to the government to raise, I don't know what they're called, like miniature fruit trees, because the land is more prized in Japan. And so they were left a lot of money so they could develop bearing fruit trees by making the trees smaller and producing more fruit. So they were good people that really, they never had children, and so they were very thoughtful, and their gifts keep going on. So she was indebted to Japan and gave back at the end of her life. One of her friends who became a close friend of mine was Bruce in Verarity. Again, some of these people were children or grandchildren of immigrants that ended up in Seattle or the Northwest, and his family was from Scotland. And he became obsessed with Japanese culture and Japanese art as well, and you can see this combination, once again, of Japanese art influenced by Northwest Coast Native Americans. These are longhouses in the foreground, so he's observing the areas of the Northwest Coast Native Americans up into Canada, Queen Charlotte Island, and depicting these in a modernist way of the time. So these date from around the 1920s into the early 30s, and then he started making color linoleum block prints based on that multiple block technique and using the Japanese style, integrating it with the Native American totem poles and things like that. Now, some of you might have heard his name before, and this is why. In 1976, Mr. Verarity sold his extensive and unique collection of Native American ethnographic objects from North America to the British Museum. I don't think you have the Museum of Mankind anymore at the British Museum. I think it's gone, but his collection is one of the feature collections of Northwest Native American art. And finally, I'm going to show you another, this again is a technique rather than imagery that was used by certain artists in the Northwest. And it's, again, excuse my mispronunciation, it's a gomazuri technique where the baron is in printmaking with block printing. It's it's like this little pressured little pad that transfers the ink to the paper. So it's like not going through a press, but it gives a pressure to rub against the between the block and the ink, and then you pull the print off of that, right? So this technique, this gomazuri technique, they turn the baron on its side because the side of it's metal, and you get this wonderful, can you see there the almost a scribbly kind of effect? So they're using traditional methods in Japan. This is Gotando and Shinsui Ito, and you see these beautiful prints with a more decorative modern approach by tilting the baron and causing this sort of sketchy, different type of linear lines, or lines that were sort of random and sketchy. And then this is adapted by Helmi Juvonen, a daughter of Finnish immigrants, who also was one of the key printmakers there. And she's using this technique to produce some of the most unusual prints I've ever seen in the United States. Again, she was friends with a man who was Native American, and Bruce in Verarity, who I just showed you. And she's using these works, by going to Indian dances and ceremonial assemblages. She would go and get the imagery and use it in her block printing. And you can see the recto as the finished print there. It's called the wolf dance. And then the verso, where she's rubbing the baron the same way that I just showed you with the Japanese printmakers. And finally, these are two of her images. There was an artist who became very famous in Seattle named Mark Tobey, and that's her self-portrait. She had a very kind of sad, she fell in love with him, and even sent out her own wedding invitations. The problem was he was gay, and so she had this unrequited love for him, and she obsessively did these unusual prints depicting him, and like I said, she made her wedding invitations in this same type of manner. So I hope you enjoyed my little introduction to printmaking and painting influenced by Japan and Japanese artists in the Northwest, and I'm happy to answer any questions.